And we're back now for a little analysis with Leigh Gallagher, the assistant managing editor of Fortune, David Ignatius, who we heard from earlier, of course, columnist for the Washington Post, national security correspondent for the New York Times, David Sanger, and our own CBS News congressional correspondent, Nancy Cordes. Nancy, let's just start with this prisoner release this morning. We're hearing from Republicans who seem to be very, very concerned. You heard Bernie Sanders, who's actually an independent, saying he wants some more information about this. Are we going to hear from any Democrats who are upset by this, or is this going to break along partisan lines?
Right now it's breaking along partisan lines. So far, all of the Democrats we've heard from, and it's still early, are saying, look, what options did the White House have? In the old days, when we used to negotiate with other countries, when we had prisoners of war, they would do a swap. Now when we go to war, we're at war with terrorists. So what are the administration officials supposed to do? Republicans, however, I'm told, are already gearing up for possibly multiple investigations and hearings in several different House committees. You heard from the House Armed Services Chair, Buck McKeon, who put out this very strongly worded statement saying he thinks the president broke the law by failing to inform Congress that he was going to be moving Guantanamo Bay prisoners. And I'm told that the Speaker of the House, John Boehner, essentially agrees with him.
David, where do you see this going on Capitol Hill? Is this going to go on for a while, or?
It's already a political fight, and you can see the lines being drawn. I thought Senator McCain was quite cautious. He wasn't talking about breaking the law or any of that. I think there'll be other questions as well. One is these very dangerous Taliban people being now in Qatar. Another is, was this release deal available 4 years ago? I'm told basically it was. These same names, 5 names, were circulated 4 years ago. We could have saved a lot of time and money and suffering for Bowe Bergdahl if this is the deal that we were going to make.
But as you pointed out earlier in the broadcast, Secretary
Panetta
said no way, no how.
Yes, sir.
I wonder what do you think it was, David Sanger, that changed the mind of the current Secretary of Defense?
Well, I think 2 things have changed since then. The first was that 4 years ago, there was a thought that this would be a confidence-building measure that would be on the way to a more comprehensive deal with the Taliban, something that would enable some kind of a settlement. The hope of that is now pretty well gone. And at this point, it was a question of trying to get Bergdahl out of there before American troops all left the region, or if the president gets his way, he'll keep 10,000 there. But this was a question more of closure than of political settlement. It is interesting that 4 years ago, it was not only Republicans who had concerns at that time about releasing these 5 members of the Taliban. There were some prominent Democrats along the way who similarly had concerns. It would be interesting to see if they come back now and issue their same worries.
You know, Leigh, it's going to be interesting to see what Hillary Clinton is going to have to say about this. Her book, Big Deal, coming out here. She'll start giving interviews. We've already seen one chapter given to Politico about Benghazi. Where do you see her coming down? I know you've been tracking her activities lately.
Well, it's interesting, yes, and this book launch will be interesting to see. Basically the biggest book launch, I think, since Lean In came out last year. I think that's safe to say. And you're already seeing the very strategic ways it's happening. The deliberate leak video this week coming out on actually where she addressed inequality a little bit, which I think will be interesting to watch. But, you know, she's going to come down. I mean, it'll be interesting to see where she comes down on this. I think that she will probably defend the administration's decision, as she has been, you know, doing for a while now. So.
But yeah, that raises the point. Obviously, she must have known about this. I mean, back then, when if what David Ignatius is saying that this was on the table some years ago, it'll be interesting to see how she weighed in on that back then.
In fact, the idea of having open conversations with the Taliban, subject to certain limits in which they would agree to future limits on what they do, began under Secretary Clinton in February 2011. So this began on her watch. Her appointment as Richard Holbrooke's successor, as special mediator, Mark Grossman, had at least 3 or 4 meetings with the Taliban in secret to discuss this very issue of trading these 5. The idea that this five people have just suddenly sprung up. No, the names have been circulated for a long time, and Secretary Clinton knew about it. I'm sure it's an issue that will come up during her campaign. In terms of her book, you know, we're all waiting to see. That's the case she wants to make. that I'd be a good president because I was a good Secretary of State. So I want to read the book and see how she makes that case.
You know, when the Secretary's book comes out, I think people are going to be looking at it for the obvious, Benghazi and so forth, and I think she was very smart to get that part out early. But they're also going to be looking at it for a range of other decisions that she made. She was the more hawkish member of the cabinet, and whether or not she signs on completely to the negotiations now underway with Iran will be, and the kind of terms that are being discussed in which Iran would retain some kind of ability to make nuclear fuel. That'll be an interesting one. She'll be examined pretty closely for all of the things that she says about the ultimate decision to leave Afghanistan with just a tiny number of troops there.
And it's no accident that that Benghazi chapter was the first substantive chapter to be released. Her aides tell me they've come to the conclusion Benghazi is not going to go away. It's the main issue that is going to hound her if she decides to run for president. It's catnip to the Republican base. They wanted to get it out there, show her position, have her be able to make her case in 34 pages. And it's no accident that they met with Democratic groups this week to lay out her case so that everyone is on the same page.
Before we get to Hillary Clinton's presidency, let's talk about the current one. The president made a speech about foreign policy at West Point this week. I don't remember this ever happening. The Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal also in various stages of being critical of that speech. What did you think, Leigh?
Well, you know, being in the middle isn't sexy. You know, we like strong narratives, we like big, brawny success stories, shows of might. And what the president has been trying to say is that this policy of not isolationism, not interventionism, somewhere in between, it's really hard to sell that, I think. But the fact is, I do think we're in a new era of fighting our fights across the world. Sometimes unilateral intervention is called for. Sometimes sanctions can be quite powerful. I think we've seen that in Iran and to some degree in Russia. And we have a new challenge in front of us looming, I think, which is cyber terrorism and cyber warfare. And so there's all these different fights, not to mention the incredibly now splintered diaspora of all the terrorist networks that have really multiplied and kind of calcified and gotten more threatening and more ruthless. So we are in a phase now that I think calls for a menu of choices, but that doesn't really, singles and doubles doesn't play well.
The president says we're not withdrawing anywhere in the world. We're not pulling back. But I must say, I was in Israel for 10 days last week, and I see stories in the papers there, and they say since the president's withdrawal from the Middle East, since the American pullback from the Middle East, there is a perception, at least among some, that we are pulling back, David.
I hear that wherever I travel, and in a sense the president is saying this decade in which we were interventionist and got ourselves into real trouble by, I think most Americans would agree, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were costly and difficult. He's saying that period is ending. What he hasn't been as effective at is explaining how we're going to project power in the future. And there is this question, The Economist magazine had a famous cover, what would America fight for? And that's the question people are wondering about. There are parts of that speech, to be honest, that I liked a lot. I thought, he talking about how without good military options, we were able to put pressure on Vladimir Putin, so he didn't disrupt the election. In the end, it went forward, and I think he's right to say that's a modest success for his policy.
Retrenchment's hard to sell, and so the president had a difficult task here. I thought the best part of the speech was the restatement of the Obama doctrine, which was that the U.S. would come into fight when its own direct interests are affected, but that it will insist that allies and other partners come in when there's just a general good. And this was his effort to explain why he didn't go into Syria or why he left Libya so quickly. I thought that the weakest parts of the speech were, first, an inability to explain how we were going to use new elements of our power. Leigh mentioned one in the cyber power. The president has never explained publicly how the United States would use its new arsenal of cyber weapons. I thought the second was a failure to really grapple in the speech with a big change of tone from China and Russia. You've got the Chinese now in a conflict with the Vietnamese over territory and with the Japanese. You've got the Russians obviously taking a much more assertive, aggressive new view. And the president, I think, needed to explain whether or not the U.S. was going to choose these as moments where he did view our central national interests at stake.
Nancy, what is Congress doing these days? I mean, you know, they pretty much announced in February they weren't going to do any major things. They pretty much said
they're sticking to
check
that.
With us, check with us after the election.
Right.
Here you have a world just in turmoil, and what is going on up there? Are they focused on anything besides raising money and their own re-elections?
Well, this week they're making a lot of hay about the VA and the situation there, which frankly is a little bit disingenuous because, as the Inspector General at the VA pointed out, they've been doing reports since 2005 showing that wait times at the VA are being manipulated. So for the VA secretary, for the president, for anyone in the administration, or for Congress to say, this is such a shock, I've been lied to, I'm completely surprised by this, is, again, it's disingenuous. Now, if some real genuine legislation comes out of this, like Senator Sanders was talking about, that could be a good thing. Over in the House, in the VA committee, they're working on legislation that would enable veterans who are waiting longer than a certain amount of time, say 30 days for an appointment, to be able to go outside of the system and get care from a private facility. That's legislation, depending on how it's crafted, that could be bipartisan. So if Congress doesn't just drop the ball like it often does in these situations and say, well, Secretary Shinseki is gone, that takes care of that, let's move on to something new. If they stick with it, it could do some good.
Leigh, what do you think is going to happen now? I mean,
I think that this is a leadership crisis of the highest order, a management crisis, let me rephrase that, of the highest order. The problems, yes, they were there. Shinseki inherited them, but they are massive, and it's everything. It's the scale, it's sprawling, and the problem is systemic. The performance management, the bonus structure is just completely out of line, and setting unattainable goals and encouraging people to try to meet them however means possible. And then the issue of the doctor shortage is incredibly large. I mean, the irony of all this is that the care is quite good. The VA has innovated when it comes to care. But the shortage, by the way, also is our entire medical system is facing that. There are limits placed on the number of physicians that come out of residency each year, and that's capped, and it hasn't changed since 1997.
Right.
So there's a number of problems.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Leigh, and thank you for joining us this morning. We'll be seeing you on CBS This Morning tomorrow, where you will reveal this year's big 500 companies list that Fortune always puts out. So we'll be back in a moment with our Face the Nation flashback.